Welcome to the Plant Cunning Podcast,
where we explore our relationship to plants, other people, and the mysteries of nature.
Coming to you from the high Allegheny Plateau in central New York.
We are your hosts, A.C. Stauble
and Isaac Hill. Episode 17, The Druid's Garden, with herbalist, blogger, and Archdruid Dana O'Driscoll. In this episode, we speak with Dana about what druidry is, about growing up in western Pennsylvania in the forest, about studying herbalism in Michigan with Jim McDonald, and how she healed her asthma with New England Aster. We speak with her about her art, about her new plant spirit oracle divination tool, and about the importance of art and blogging. I hope you enjoy the episode.
Hey y'all, AC here. Before we bring on Dana, I just wanted to make a quick announcement to our listeners about an event that I'm helping to organize coming up in mid-February. The event is an online small business Skillshare. It's going to be a week-long series of presentations and workshops and some networking opportunities for folks to really hone their small business skills in 2021. Small business owners have to wear a lot of different hats, as you probably know. So we're going to be bringing together experts in the field of running a small business to talk to you about logo and branding, graphics design, how to just clarify your business idea and create a marketing strategy. The event starts February 16th and is hosted by Maple Creative, which is a super rad small business that I'm working with who helps authors and educators and herbalists grow their online business with web development and online courses, creating live events, and things like that. So please check out their website to register for the event for free and learn more about it. So you can go to buildwithmaple.com. That's buildwithmaple.com to learn more. And without further ado, I am honored to welcome Dana O'Driscoll.
Okay, well, welcome Dana O'Driscoll to the Plant Cunning Podcast. You're an herbalist, a permaculturist, a druid, a writer, an artist. What brought you to all of this stuff?
Well, first of all, thank you so much for having me on. I'm really excited to talk with you.
Likewise.
What brought me here? Wow. It's always interesting to think about the journey that you've taken to get somewhere. I think that when I was a child, I spent a lot of time in nature. I had a grandfather who was really into mushroom hunting and things like that. And when I was a teenager, the forest that I spent all this time in was cut down. And it was logged. Like they call it sustainable logging, but let's make no mistake, the forest was very destroyed. And it wasn't until my mid-20s that I could even go back in. And when I did, I saw so much regeneration and so much life, and just recognizing the healing power of nature in different ways. So I would say that what brought me into it was both childhood and those connections with nature, but really seeing the forest cut, having that terrible traumatic thing sort of experience, and then being able to re-enter that forest, 10 years later and being like, wow, look at all the healing that's taken place. Look at the healing power of nature, which of course ties to permaculture design, that ties to herbalism, that ties to druidry, that also ties to my art. And so that's sort of I think that regeneration is sort of the core theme for me, really. And it's really an important theme today too. So sort of how I got here in part is because anybody who's practicing herbalism or these other things, anybody who's connected with nature, we're all really worried about where we're heading as humans.
Yeah.
And I think that finding those kinds of things that really sustain us, and how do we reframe our relationship? And I think it's those kinds of early deep experiences that can help. So kind of getting off topic, but I think that those were really powerful moments for me in sort of my own path.
Yeah. So you spent a lot of time in nature as a child?
Yeah. I grew up on the edge of probably what's several hundred acres of forest. What I didn't know when I was a child, it's funny because my cousins and I, when we were young, used to crawl through the forest and, make cabins and build little dams in the little stream and everything.
Yeah.
And we never really understood. We saw all these old stumps and they were growing what I later learned was reishi mushroom, which of course is its own lesson. Um, so the stumps get cut by humans and then they respond by growing the most medicinal mushroom in the world, right?
Yeah.
But when I was a child, I didn't really understand what I was seeing, and we actually thought that maybe aliens had come and cut the stump. So,
Yeah, natural thought progression.
yeah, like a fire had happened. It never occurred to me that people would come and cut them. That's the innocence of a child. And I spent all of that time and got to know many, dear trees as friends, and just started really, I don't know, it was like when you're a child, nature is such a magical thing. It's so, I don't know, there's such a connection and I guess, yeah, like a sacredness to it, that I think as adults, we're always trying to find, we're always seeking that. So yeah, to me, that was such a formative experience. And I did lose myself in sort of consumerism and gaming and sort of, I don't know, the 20th century and even into the 21st century, just sort of, I don't know, the technology and evils of the age, maybe. Not that everything's evil, but there's a lot of stuff that really takes us away from nature. And, it was sort of like that coming back to the forest when I said, like, when I was 25, that really sort of, I don't know, it almost like rekindled what I had happen in my life earlier on, if that makes sense.
Yeah. So what happened after 25? Did you start into herbalism, permaculture, or druidry first?
I actually started with druidry, but they all kind of happened at the same time. I sort of had an awakening at that point. Like I had spent, a good part of my late teens and early 20s, all through my undergrad, sort of just, playing games and just, doing the usual typical American thing, not really thinking much of it. And then had this sort of really powerful experience, and it really did change me. And I didn't discover permaculture right away. It was a couple of years had passed, and the same with herbalism. It wasn't until I moved to Michigan after I was done with graduate school that I got to meet Jim McDonald and practice herbalism. But those ideas were always circulating. And I really think that they're all really interrelated, so nature, spirituality, herbalism, permaculture, all these things are really, they're all just different ways of thinking about how do we work with nature as a healing and regenerative experience for ourselves, and how do we in turn honor nature and reciprocate.
Yeah, it's all it seems like it all fits together so well. It's very harmonious.
Yeah, so I was wondering if you could explain to our listeners too, what is druidry?
Oh, sure. that's the question, right? That's $1 million question. In part because if you ask 5 different druids this question, you might get 10 different answers. I want to be very clear that I'm not speaking on behalf of all druids, because druidry, it's kind of it's in many ways it's very anti-dogmatic. Druids believe that nature is sacred. Maybe the one thing we can all agree on is that nature is good, and that we all find some kind of spiritual connection to it. But what I can say is that there are a lot of druids that have some similar practices. So for example, many of us focus on living a wheel of the year, perhaps localized to our ecosystem, where, it's like, how do I use what I see in nature and connect that to my own life? So for example, right now, it's January. Pretty soon the maple trees here, I live in Western Pennsylvania, our maple trees will be running pretty soon. Spring will slowly be coming back in. But in the deep, dark cold of January, I say, well, what are nature's lessons that might benefit me? How can I learn from this? And so nature is our sacred text, if you will. It's our church, if you want to use those kinds of terms.
The living church, living text.
Yeah, exactly. And so that's really the core of druidry. There are historical pieces that a lot of us use. So for example, in druidry, there's sort of 3 divisions. There are bards, ovates, and druids. And these actually reflect the ancient druids and their 3 categories of folks that were doing this work. So the bards, if you may have heard this term before, right? In the modern druid, in today's druidry, bardism and bardic arts are all about creative practices. They're all about channeling what we call the awen, or like creative inspiration or flowing inspiration. And so there's this whole sort of side of druidry that's all about, like, I'm going to be inspired by nature and create things. And that might be like, I'm a visual artist, I'm a painter. I do leather work, I do those sorts of things. Or maybe I create like herbal blends, right? There's the ovate path, which is all about the natural world, which is like where you learn about like botany and things like that, right?
Yeah.
And how to actually identify trees and what plants do.
Mhm.
And also some more, maybe their divination properties. And then the druid path is the final one. And that's kind of where you get things like mysticism and, you know, you get ritual, you get journeying, meditation. And so these three paths kind of all interrelate to form this kind of really interesting, I think, cohesive whole that allows for a lot of individual exploration and a lot of individual focus. So I guess that's sort of in a nutshell some of the big pieces of the Druid tradition, at least.
Cool. Yeah, it seems to me that druidry is very idiosyncratic. I've met some different druids in my days, and they all seem very different. They all go on their own ways.
Yeah. And I think part of that is that we don't, druidry, we don't specify a set of belief systems.
Mm-hmm.
So most religions, particularly like the big religions, it's like you have to believe these certain things, right? There's a set of beliefs, perhaps in deity and the afterlife, those kinds of things. In druidry, that's not something that we all agree on, and that's not something we all care to agree on. So, that's not the important question, if you will.
Right.
And I think that's really like a lot of druids, maybe some of them, I've met a lot of animists, like I'm an animist druid. There's polytheistic druids, there's monotheistic druids, we have Christian druids, and we have, atheistic druids. So that's like the whole idea of deity isn't really that important. It's more like spend time in nature, learn from nature, grow, and then you can sort of add what else on you might like.
Yeah, that's really interesting because, like, when a lot of people think of religion, they think about worshiping a specific deity or spirit or set of spirits or deities. And it's interesting that druidry isn't even about that necessarily. It's about nature.
No, yeah, I mean, that's why I said nature's our church, our sacred text, and yeah, like I said, and I think that like that pluralness of it is really interesting because it's not really about who you worship. That's not the point. Like there's a lot of people who do maybe worship or work with a deity or a spirit, but you don't have to. You could literally, like I have several people that I've worked with over the years in mentoring that are atheist druids, and they really just want that deep spiritual connection, that meditation with the living earth.
Yeah.
And they want to work, like a lot of them are working on herbalism and learning how to like do wild food and things like that, and that's enough for them, and that's cool.
Yeah, we spoke with Seven Song maybe a couple months ago, and he has a very deep connection to herbs and plants, but he just doesn't have the spiritual impulse. I mean, for him, the connecting with the plants in the way he does is enough, and I think that's really interesting. Letting people have different ways of experiencing the numinous or the reality or the world or whatever it is.
Yeah, totally. And I think like I'm the Grand Archdruid in AODA right now. That's the Ancient Order of Druids in America.
Yeah.
And I've been involved in some leadership capacity in AODA for about 8 or 9 years now. Maybe that long, maybe like 7, I don't know, somewhere around there. But that's really an important part of that kind of approach to druidry. It's like we're going to offer you a set of practices so that you can cultivate a relationship with nature, so that you can learn how to do some basic spiritual stuff like meditation and grounding and protection and so on. But in the end, you're the one who has to sort of figure out how you want to fill that out.
Yeah.
And that's, even just getting people, like one of our core practices, go into nature every week, observe, interact, right? And just getting people to do that is a huge step for a lot of people, and that will lead to all sorts of other amazing things, right? So it is really cool how you can see the different, even within our order, and our order is definitely very diverse. Like you can really see the different manifestations of what that ends up looking like, partly based on the person and their background, but also based on their ecosystem and where they live.
Cool. So can you tell us a little bit about the AODA and like how you got into it and what it is?
Yeah, sure. The AODA is actually quite an old Druid order. It was founded in 1912, which is,
wow, yeah.
In terms of spiritual orders, it's possible that we're now the oldest, like one of the oldest continuous Druid orders in the world. I'm not sure. But the AODA it's the Ancient Order of Druids in America, and most of our members are in North America, either in Canada or the US, but we do have members in South America and in Europe and other places. And it's an order, like I said, that's really focused on the key thing that we do is really help people reconnect with nature, help people reconnect with their own and develop some kind of inner life, whether that's through meditation or whatever, and really teach people sort of, I don't know, there's when you look at the typical person that comes into Druidry or into AODA, it's somebody who's like, there's something missing. I don't know what it is, but all I want to do is be close to nature, and that's where a lot of people start. They
Right.
recognize that, TV and phones and everything else are fine, but they're just not doing it for them. But they don't really necessarily have a sense of, well, what can I do that's different? And so we have like a 3-stage curriculum where people can, it's essentially sort of like a choose your own adventure, I like to describe it as. People, there are things like we have books for you to read and, studying nature and all these experiential practices. But in the end, it's like you sort of choose the things you want to focus on. Do you want to focus on bardic arts? Do you want to focus as a novate, as a druid? And then people can kind of work their way through the curriculum over a period of years. And like I said, we are really committed to that diversity piece, right? So that everybody who comes in, regardless of who you are, what you believe, what you look like, what you do, there's a place for you if you want to learn more about nature and the living earth, right? And connect. And so I think that's a powerful thing in today's age. We're not saying you have to believe this or you have to do this. We're just saying, hey, if you want to learn more about nature spirituality, we can help you do that. And here are the ways. And, I ended up in the place I am because these practices really worked for me. I joined AODA in 2006. And, I've been doing these practices for a long time, and they sort of have really deeply shaped who I am in many ways. They led me to practice permaculture. They led to both the oracle decks I've produced and sort of my deep engagement with the arts and really the synthesis of like magic and plants and nature and art. And so I'm really grateful. And so this is my way of offering service, is to, make sure that these practices are available to other people who might find them of use.
That's really cool.
Yeah, it's awesome. You mentioned earlier studying with Jim McDonald, and I'm just curious what that experience was like studying with him and how you incorporate herbalism into your homestead and your community and your practices now.
Sure. I think, to go back to this idea of connection and regeneration, one of the things that I have been trying to figure out for a long time is how do we get the average person to reconnect with nature? Maybe you don't, maybe the spiritual thing isn't your thing. Maybe you already have a spiritual path or a religious path, right? But, you look at the average everyday person, who's deeply embedded in this culture and in some of the more problematic assumptions about nature, right? And about the world and our place in it. And you say, well, how do we reconnect? And one of the things that I have found consistently, which is why I do plant walks and herbalism, is that people have value when they find something of use. In other words, if I can teach somebody about dandelion and maybe they can use it to help them, or like New England Aster is one of my favorites, right? Like that can get people off of asthma medication. It got me off of asthma medication.
Mm-hmm.
I can tell that story. That's a Jim McDonald story.
Yeah.
But it's like, if you can just get people to understand that nature has real value, and ultimately that everything that they have and everything that, like, I'm sitting in a room, that's all of this is given by nature. It might be several steps removed, but it's all from nature ultimately.
Mm-hmm.
And so if you can get people there, then you really have something. And so I started studying both wild food foraging and herbalism, in part because I definitely needed a lot more knowledge than I had, but in part because I was hoping that through, and really permaculture too, all of these things, homesteading, all of these things, in part because I thought, well, one is I need to better my own life and I need to reconnect individually, but also because I was hoping that I could share this knowledge with others. And when I lived in Southeast Michigan, I lived there for 6 years. That's when I was able to study with Jim McDonald and some of the other traveling teachers he brought through, and really deeply embedded myself in both wild foods and herbalism. And then when I came to Western Pennsylvania, where I'm the only person who knows most of the things I know in my county, and there's only a couple of us in the entire, like, I would say Southwestern Pennsylvania.
Yeah.
I've met 3 or 4 other people who do plant walks and stuff. There's not many people. Like, that's knowledge that's really powerful.
Where are you in Western Pennsylvania? I'm from Beaver County, and I'm in New York now, but there's not that much going on there.
I'm really thankful I got all of these like classes and teachings and herbalism, natural building, and permaculture and everything when I was in Michigan, because coming back here, Like, I still don't feel like I know that much, but I know more than most people here. So,
Yeah.
it's sort of like, I'm in Indiana County, and I actually grew up in Cambria County. So both of those are quite rural. They're both east of Pittsburgh.
Yeah. Yeah. I was raised in Beaver County, which is kind of like part rural, part post-industrial.
Yeah, it's
Basically.
all rural post-industrial out here. And that's sort of,
Yeah.
I mean, if you think about it, like you had asked me about my background, and I actually think that part of this has to do with growing up in the landscape that I grew up in.
That makes a lot of sense. Yeah.
It's like when you walk down to the local, we call it the crick. Okay, I'm gonna
Yeah.
Yeah.
playing in here.
Go down the creek.
When you walk down to the crick and it's orange and it's full of sulfur,
Yeah.
and full of iron, and
Yeah.
it smells and there's no life in it, and then you walk down, you continue walking and you see all of this acid mine drainage. You see what we call bony dumps or soil tips, these giant piles of refuse from old mines, and then you see the abandoned steel mills, and like there's something
Right.
about that, it embeds in you. And I think you can go in a couple of directions, right? You can go in the, okay, I'm just going to embody this is just part of my embodied landscape, I'm going to accept it, in this whole post-industrial, the Rust Belt mentality, which we see a lot of people doing. Or you could say, I'm going to learn permaculture and I'm going to learn how to regenerate that bony pile, and I'm going to learn how to bring healing and life back to this land. So,
Yeah.
Pittsburgh's kind of interesting too, in that way. Like, I lived in Pittsburgh, in the city, for a little while, and there's so many pockets of regenerating forest, like within the city limits, that used to be houses or whatever, and the ecosystems there are so like there's like some native plants, and then a lot of like Rose of Sharon and various other like escaped
And
plants.
wildlife, like owls and foxes and deer and all sorts of things are like right in the city, in these like recovered places where the land just like has taken it back. It's really cool.
Yeah, and old foundations and slag piles and everything.
Yeah. And I think we really have to, as sort of, as people who are living in sort of 21st century America, I think we really have to say, what are we going to do with these spaces?
Yeah.
Like, a lot of my training in permaculture came in the Detroit metro area. And if you want to talk about a place that's really interesting, from sort of like, okay, we've had this massive decline, a third of the people that used to live here are left, right? There's like 1/3 of people, and there used to be 2/3 more, even less.
Yeah, just like Pittsburgh.
Exactly. And so I think we've got these cities that are all over North America that are just like that. And even rural spaces that have sort of been, they're like places no one wants. They're abandoned. But those are the places that somebody that has permaculture training and herbalism training, you go in and you already see the wild weeds that are growing there, that are like sacred medicine, just saying, oh, come use me, Or you see like there's an abandoned, there's just a blank slate where this lawn used to be, and you're like, boy, how many vegetables could I fit in that spot? And so there's just really, like, that's part of why I'm so invested in all of these things, right? Is that there is such hope, where if you don't have the permaculture skills and the herbalism skills, and you look at that space, all that you see is something abandoned. You don't see it as something that has such potential. But you study some of this, you study permaculture, and suddenly you have a whole range of things that you could do to bring that into you could build an ecosystem. And sure, nature could build an ecosystem, but if it's in the middle of Detroit or Pittsburgh, it might take nature 250 years to build a mature ecosystem. It could take you 30,
You can help build nature. You can be part of the process. You can be nature, helping, rebuilding the ecosystem.
Yeah. So, like, to me, it's like that, going back to the forest that was cut and healed and all of this stuff, like, that's the ultimate goal. Like, if we have that kind of power within us, and, instead of saying, how can we do less bad? This is the words of Ben Falk. He's a permaculturist. And
he's great.
There's a movie called Inhabit, which you may have seen. And he talks about this at the beginning of the movie, and it really stuck with me. It's like, instead of saying, how can we do less bad? The question is, well, how can we do good?
Yeah. I mean, and I've always thought about this, like, we're kind of like, as much bad as we have done to the environment, we can do that much good too. I mean, whatever power we have to destroy things, we have that much power to help create things.
Yeah.
And we're part of nature. That's the thing that, like, a lot of people forget. But it's like, it's always, I mean, how could we be separate?
Yeah. Well, and this gets back to wild foods and herbalism, right? So
Yeah.
even on a small level, if you can take somebody and show them, hey, those maple trees, like maple syrup, you probably theoretically understand that. Hey, how about young maple leaves in the spring? Or dandelion or those sorts of things. And suddenly they start to see that nature has value and healing. Then they realize that they're a part of nature. And then they realize, hey, maybe this lawn isn't such a good idea. Like it sort of can spiral from there, right? And then suddenly we've got a bunch of people doing really good things and can really turn. I really believe, I mean, this is my hope, right? It's like you see all these terrible projections for, you know, what we're going through right now. And I mean, those things are true, but I also think there's so many different movements that are all doing the same thing, you know, druidry and herbalism, permaculture, you know, there's so many different movements out there that are all trying to do the same thing, which is like reconnect us with nature, recognize that we can be a force of good and healing, and recognize that nature can reciprocate that, you know. And that's just like blows your mind when you really sit down and think about it.
So how did you heal your asthma with New England Aster?
Sure. Okay. So this is my Jim McDonald story. So, you know, once I got really deep into druidry, you know, you start seeing nature as sacred, and then you just can't sit around. Like, it's not just about going to the woods and having some woo woo. Sure, that might be part of it, and that's kind of fun, right? Go in the woods and be like, "Ah, nature's so wonderful." But in the end, like, nature's being destroyed all around you, so you better start, you know, arming yourself with some tools and skills. And so, I met Jim McDonald. We were doing these permaculture meetups, and I met him at a permaculture meetup, and we started talking. And I had somehow we got on the subject. You know, Jim is such a wonderful person, but he's always asking the strangest questions. You know, like, you know, he routinely asks you about like your poop and things like that. You know, because that's just who he is. And we got on the topic of my asthma, and he's like, you know, I was like, I've got this herb, and actually, I you know, New England Aster was actually an herb that, you know, he kind of rediscovered. New England Aster is, you know, it's the really beautiful deep purple aster with the yellow core, and it has this really deep aromatic smell. And what we know about any aromatic, and a lot of aromatics, that's where the medicine is. And so, you know, he started experimenting with it, and, you know, discovered that it had this really fantastic lung, sort of lung capacity. You know, it helped with lungs, it helped with tightness of breath, shortness of breath. And so I was actually sort of one of his early test subjects on this. And he's like, hey, Dana, you have pretty chronic asthma. It's quite bad. Like, do you want to try taking this tincture and see what happens? And I was like, yeah, sure. And literally, like, at the time, I was on 4 different asthma medicines. I had the fast acting inhaler, I had the nebulizer, I had like another regular inhaler, and then I had like the Advair, like inhaling like the pill, like there was that little pill you crushed. And and the medicines are awful. You know, they had really bad side effects.
They make you like all jittery. They're, you know,
yeah, like
your tongue gets all gross. I have asthma too, so I can relate to all
okay, you know exactly what I'm talking about. So there's really serious side effects with these things. And I was just at the point where I was like, I don't want to live the rest of my life with this. Is there anything else I can do? And so we talked about diet, and he actually had me work with a dietitian on an elimination diet. And then we worked with the New England Aster. And literally within a couple of months, I was off all 4. I mean, I still keep my nebulizer and my fast acting inhaler around. I can't actually tell you the last time I used either. It's probably been a couple of years, where I used to be daily, right? Oh, yeah. And I cut gluten from my diet. Turns out I'm pretty allergic to it. And it actually was causing a lot of lung inflammation. And then I used New England Aster regularly, like every day. And I'm off of all of them. And so after this experience, when Jim does his 4-season herbal class, when it came up, I was like, please sign me up, because if one plant that's literally growing as a weed by the side of the road can do this, what's the possibility for other plants? And so it just really opened up this whole new world. And you know, it's just like, it just blows your mind when you realize the power of plants. And all of our medicine originally was derived from plants anyways.
Yeah.
And the science behind a lot of this now is fascinating, you know, especially like some of the mushroom research and things. So I started studying with Jim. I took his 4-season herbal intensive. I want to say that was like 2013-ish, somewhere in there. And then I started learning about how to do like plant walks and things like that, and really getting deep into wild foods also. And what I liked so much about the way that Jim taught is that Jim taught us about reverence and respect.
Oh, yeah.
You know, like we learned about poison ivy, not as, oh, avoid this. Okay, yeah, you're going to avoid poison ivy, but like, poison ivy is an awareness plant. It teaches us to observe, and it teaches us to pay attention, which is a lesson that we all need in the 21st century, right? And so I really I loved learning those things, and I really feel like it just added to everything else I was already doing and just gave me another sort of piece of this. And then of course, when I moved here to Western Pennsylvania, it was something that I was able to share because there just wasn't other people that really knew the things I did. So it was really, like I said, it was a really important piece, and I didn't realize it at the time, but coming back here, which is where I'm at now, it really did allow me to sort of do some of that work with people like, hey, let's talk about the dandelion. Let's talk about New England Aster. And there's a couple of people that take New England Aster that I know now, and, that are here, and they grow it in their backyard, and they're off their asthma medicine. And, so I'm grateful to Jim because, he just opened up so many doorways for that.
Yeah, I learned about New England Aster from another herbalist, Amanda David in Ithaca, who learned it from Jim McDonald. And she was a guest teacher during Seven Songs program, and we got to spend a whole day with her and sit with the plant and really get to know it. And she uses a lot on like kids who have like whooping cough, like a really hacky cough. So in addition to asthma, it's been something that she found a lot of success with too with it.
Yeah.
I just think it's also just such a beautiful plant. It's probably one of my favorite flowers.
Magnificent. Yeah.
That deep purple. And the resin the aromatic resin is wonderful.
Have you guys ever looked at it really closely as it's opening and closing? Like if you can look at one that's in full bloom, that's got some in full bloom and some that are opening and some closing, every single one of those petals as they open is like a spiral that uncurls almost into like a Fibonacci spiral. It's like, I learned this because I started taking botanical illustration classes, and like you have to really deeply observe plants in a different way than you would as an herbalist. And oh my goodness, like that plant just has so much beauty and resonance if you get up close. So I highly recommend it.
Well, that's really interesting. How the art is another pathway into communicating and learning from the plant.
Yeah, I could talk about this all night.
Yeah, I was like, can we talk about art now? Because I was thinking you mentioned poison ivy, and I love your plant spirit oracle drawing or painting of the poison ivy, like spirit peering out from behind these leaves. You see like her eye like peeking out, like, I won't mess with you if you won't mess with me.
Believe it or not, I have that one hanging in my office. Like, none of my students know what it is, of course, but I thought it was funny that I have poison ivy, catnip, spruce, and hawthorn hanging in my office.
Oh yeah, sounds very protective. Like, this is my space. I got it. I got space. It's really cool.
Yeah. Okay. So this kind of goes back to the thing I was sharing earlier about druidry. How druidry is really about thinking about those different paths, right? So. Herbalism and permaculture would very much be on that OA path, that path of really deep nature awareness. But there's these other paths, right? And so the Plant Spirit Oracle kind of goes into some of those paths. Like that was really for me as much a project about deep learning of plants as it was sort of about thinking about the spirit of plants. So sort of more broadly, when we say, okay, well, what does it mean to practice a bardic art? And what does it mean to practice art spiritually as opposed to just, for art's sake? And then I think you sort of get into the synthesis of like art and nature and spirituality, right? And so this, to me, all of the things I do, I should start by saying I have a day job. And so I'm not really out to like make a living at any of this. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like, a lot of what I try to do is think about like, this is really my ultimate goal, is how can I be a good ancestor? How can I leave this world in a place that is better than I found it? And maybe just in small ways with, individuals in my community. I'm not talking about huge scale things, but I think if there's enough of us that think this way, then we can sort of be a real force of good. So a lot of what I think about is like what are things that I can put into the world that would help humans reconnect with nature, reconnect with themselves, reconnect with their own spiritual gifts and their own creative gifts. But ultimately, how can we get us back into a healthy place where we honor and respect the living earth, right? And so as an artist, I sort of approach that really different than say as an herbalist or a homesteader or a permaculturist, because I really feel like there's a lot in art that we can bring forth. Like I had just posted something about this on my blog a couple of weeks ago, this idea of bringing a vision forth, right? So you read a lot of the fiction and the movies and stuff from, the last part of the 20th century or early 21st century, and they were all dystopian. How many
now dystopia?
Right. It's like, so how much of what we're living right now we created because we put those visions over and over again into the world, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, Keats says, like, with the poets are the unacknowledged legislators of the world. I mean, it's all artists are in a certain way. They're visioning the future.
Yeah, I'm so glad you brought this up. This is really interesting. Please.
Yeah. So to me, if I'm going to practice art, could I bring forth, in this case, the plant spirit oracle is probably my best example. Can I bring forth a vision that helps heal and that helps reconnect, and that people can say, wow, okay, like I'm gonna learn about calamus and its connection to communication, or I'm gonna learn about witch hazel, or New England aster, or poison ivy, or whatever. And so to me, it's a way of it's the same thing I'm doing with plant walks or herbs, right?
Yeah.
It's just a different medium. In this case, it's how do people become closer to nature? And maybe if they pick up the plant spirit oracle and they use it, maybe then they're going to start growing some of their own herbs, and maybe they're going to raise their awareness about, or maybe they're going to recognize aster when they see it, or witch hazel when they see it, and recognize that, as more than just something that's green and purple or whatever, yellow, but rather something that has its own, like for me, has its own spirit, has its own magic, and has its own medicine. And again, then it has value, it has use to people, and then suddenly now we care. And then to me, it's all about care. Like that's the ultimate thing. If we can get people to care, if we can bring forth those, like, permaculture has the different ethics of care. If we can bring forth that care, then we've changed the world. And so maybe it's kind of a nebulous, lofty goal for my art, but that's really what I'm hoping to do, is like get people to care and get people to connect with nature. And if I can do that in a small way, great. And if all you want to do is look at the pretty pictures, that's okay too,
Yeah, it's still a connection.
Right. Yeah, it seems like looking at the pretty pictures is a way of accessing the spirit of the plant in a way. So when you see that plant, you recognize it, you see some of its unique essence.
And like when you're doing a reading, like using it for divination, like how the plant interacts with that divination. So maybe you can tell us a little bit more about your decks and the divination system.
Yeah. So you really like hit the nail on the head, right? With the idea of connecting with the plant spirit, because I'm a druid and I'm an animist. And so to me, I have a much deeper relationship with any herb or plant or tree or whatever, if I not only have a physical relationship with it, but a metaphysical relationship. So the plant spirit oracle, and that's my most recent project. The plant spirit oracle really focuses on that. It focuses on introducing people to not only the physical aspects of the plant, but the metaphysical aspects. So like in the book that goes with it, you can learn about herbal preparations, but you can also sort of learn a little bit about the spirit of the plant. And so that's what I did. I sort of took these plants and I translated them into a spirit. And then that's a spirit you could meet. Maybe that's a card that you can set up and do a meditative journey with. And I have information about all of that in that project, how to work with it in that way. And maybe it's going to show you a new side to a plant that you didn't know before, because all of the plants are multifaceted, right? It's not like they have one side. It's just like us, like you're almost a different person to every person you meet, right? And I feel like the plants are in the same way, right? So I have that project. That's the Plant Spirit Oracle that came out, I want to say in late 2019, but 2020 has been eternal. So I'm like, my whole sense of time is off now.
For real, yeah.
I also have the Tarot of Trees, which is my first project, and that one was really motivated by some of those earlier childhood experiences I shared with you. And then I also have the newest project I have is a forthcoming book from Schiffer Publishing called Sacred Actions. And that's not an oracle or divination system. That's actually like a written book that really focuses on integrating nature, spirituality, and sustainability and permaculture. So sort of taking these different aspects and bringing them together and really thinking
super
about
exciting.
When's that coming out?
It's coming out in May 2021. And it'll be available on like Amazon and places like that.
Yeah, that's pretty soon.
Great.
That's pretty cool. So what was it like to create a divination deck? I mean, I know it's probably pretty complicated, but also intuitive and not complicated.
Yeah, I definitely think it was actually much harder the first time I did it with the Tarot of Trees, because I really didn't know what I was doing, and I didn't even start like the tarot. Both of these decks didn't start intentionally as tarot or oracle decks. They sort of started as I want to work through a theme or think about something, and then eventually later they sort of took on a life of their own. But I think that in order to do that, I mean, I think everybody has the capacity to do it if they try and, work on their skills. I don't believe that art is any kind of magical thing that you have or you don't have it. I don't believe in the concept of talent. Anybody who works hard can improve as an artist and can gain skill and can, accomplish some things. So, if you look at the Tarot of Trees, that was a much earlier work. You can see my style is much less refined compared to the Plant Spirit Oracle, which is a much, it's a work that you can see I had 10 years of experience in between them. But I think that the whole idea, I have a blog post on this I can share with you guys if you want to link it. I actually sort of broke down like, how do you actually begin thinking about creating an oracle or a tarot deck? Are you going to use someone else's system or an existing system like tarot, or are you going to just let the oracle come forth? But yeah, it was an intuitive process. For the Plant Spirit Oracle, it was sort of like I was doing a lot of meditations and I was getting a lot of these paintings through meditation and sort of meeting with the plant spirits. And usually usually I would start by working with the plants as an herbalist. So, I might work with mugwort, do some mugwort preparations, maybe drink a mugwort tea. And then usually within a week or so, mugwort would end up in my meditation, and then mugwort would be like, hey, I'd like you to paint this and here's some things about me, and then I would do that. So it was very like intuitive. And some of the meanings in the Plant Spirit Oracle really align nicely with established wisdom, and then some of them really I think go in some different directions. But again, that has to do with what the plants want to be in this deck, right? So I think that's a little bit about how it works. I don't know if that made any sense at all.
Yeah, it definitely makes sense. And right now we're looking at this beautiful art on the Zoom call of the Great Web, and it's this gorgeous mycelial network with mushrooms on the top going into a spiral with stars and cosmos under the earth, and it's just like magnificent. So can you tell us a little bit about what this art means? Card means?
This is actually in my living room. I love this painting. It's probably one of my favorite paintings I've ever done. I mean, I love mushrooms. Like, everything about mycelium is wonderful. And, that whole idea of Paul Stamets saying that mushrooms can save the world, like, I'm fully committed to that idea,
Yeah, we're on board. Yeah.
Like
back to the mushrooms and we're good.
Yeah. Like if we could just go back to the mushroom and understand mushrooms. So, this painting came about because I had been reading some really interesting, science about the gravity, like the gravity network in the universe. So you could actually draw links using like gravity of stars that sort of demonstrated their complete interconnection. And so I was really playing with this idea of like as above, so below, out the idea that, on the most minuscule, the microcosm is reflected on the macrocosm and vice versa. And so that's sort of how this painting evolved, is the idea, we have a galaxy out there, and in some ways it doesn't actually look that different than the fungal web of life, right?
Right.
And so it's really kind of reflecting that idea, and that's a really interesting like idea to meditate on, because then it sort of helps you understand like it gets to some of these ideas that I think are really important if we're going to sort of turn our situation around, so to say, like, if we are all ultimately connected to each other, then what I do to the plant or the nature outside, I also do to myself. And so it's that deep interconnection on every level, right? Whether it's in the soil, whether it's in the universe, whether it's in our own bodies. And so I think that's a really powerful idea. And one that I hopefully conveyed to some extent in this painting.
I think you did a great job with it.
Yeah, it definitely brings out the connection for sure. Yeah, and it's so important.
So you've been writing your blog now, which we'll link in the show notes.
A Druid's Garden.
Yeah, Druid's Garden. That for 10 years now?
Yeah, I think it's about that.
You've got such a wealth of resource, like information there.
So generous. Like, do you even remember all of the things that you've written about over life? Like, Like, how did you come up with all of this content? Like, it's just so amazing.
Well, about the first 5 years has ended up in this book that I'm publishing, that she's
Great.
publishing. And then I have like 2 more I'm working on that are all coming out of the blog. So one of my dear friends and mentors is John Michael Greer, and he actually taught me this as a method for writing, and I really appreciated his guidance, which is the idea of like, you get things out there, you take a seed of an idea and get it out there on the blog. And my professional life is I'm a writing instructor and a writing researcher. And so
Cool.
we have this really interesting concept in the field, which is called writing to learn. And what I have found this to be so true is like, I take a seed of an idea and I'm not even sure always where I'm going to go, but as I work on writing it for myself and for an audience, it sort of helps me deeply understand it.
Yeah.
And so yeah, and so like this idea of writing to learn, it's like if you start, and for some people, right, that might not work, right? But you know, if you have some kind of art form that you can help convey your ideas or your insights, whether it's journaling, whether it's writing poetry, that actually helps you deepen your own understanding, and then it helps others too. So
yeah, I've definitely found that with music for myself, like working through something in a song helps me understand it better, and then it's a way you can communicate with others that.
Yeah. So you get like multiple benefit. Like you get
Right.
the benefit of like the meditative practice of engaging in it, and then you get the benefit of other people get to read it and get something from it, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, so the Druid's Garden blog, I think it's been around since 2011. I'd have to look. I was in there this week and I have 468 posts. So there's a lot on there.
Yeah, that's a lot.
And you know, it's really pretty like, you know, it's pretty much all the stuff we've been talking about. There's herbalism, there's permaculture, homesteading, and you get some gratuitous goose photos because I have geese and I love that. And there's artwork, you know, a lot of druidry, and that's really was just a place for me to sort of, I don't know. It really started when I was still working on my own AODA practices. I was working on like the AODA has three degrees, and the third degree is really like the open-ended, like, hey, come up with a project and work on it. And so my project was actually integrating permaculture and druidry, and I started the blog in order to kind of document and understand some of what I was doing. And then it sort of just continued on, and by the time I was done, I was like, wow, this is a really important part of my own thinking. So you asked where I get ideas, kind of everywhere, you know. I just I don't know, like I don't know if I have an answer for that. Things come to me. I do really think it's important to keep learning always, so I'm always trying to take new classes. And you know, even if I'm out there teaching people about plants, like I feel like there's no end to what you can learn. So I try as often as possible to learn other things and then share that on the blog and then learn from my readers. And it's fun. I like it. It's an important part of my life, I guess. And I think it's been, you know, it's helped other people in some ways too, which is always nice.
Yeah, that makes sense. It's like your process of learning and creating relationships with the plants and really like understanding ideas and having interaction. That's really cool.
Yeah. And I think that like I think the most important thing too is that like a lot of this stuff that we're working on it's old and it's new. So like we have a whole civilization that we essentially are going to have to rewrite in order to like solve our problems. Mm-hmm. And so I think there's this this is sort of part of my personal service to the planet. It's part of my personal service to nature has given me so much. It has given me like so much healing and joy, and I have to reciprocate. And one of the ways that my personal, like something that I was trained in and something that I'm good at is teaching and writing. And so I'm sort of trying to take the things that I have been trained in and that I do well and share them in ways that might make a difference for this planet and others. And so that's really like, that's why the Druid's Garden exists. That's why the Plant Spirit Oracle exists. You know, it's just a lot of that stuff is all there for that reason ultimately.
I think that's wonderful. I've been liking your profiles on the trees because being from Western Pennsylvania, like those are all my favorite trees too. You did one on Aurelia spinosa, which is not like a tree that I think a lot of people know about, but I think it's just one of the most beautiful plants I've ever seen.
Yeah. I'm actually in the next like couple of months, I'm going to be doing a lot of really like what I'm calling the understory. The understory trees like Aurelia spinosa, which is Devil's Walking Stick, and rhododendron, and I already did. I'm doing American Hazel. I'm working on that one. And iron.
So sassafras. Are you
That's
doing pawpaw?
I will do pawpaw. I haven't done it yet, but I will do pawpaw. And yeah, that whole series. So this kind of gets into like here in North America. Obviously, we have this terrible legacy. Like I'm a white person, and my family, my ancestors stole land from Native Americans. They drove them from the land and they killed them, and that's what happened. And then, of course, they pillaged the land for 3 centuries, and that's literally the ancestor legacy I have. And so when I sort of when I try to reconcile that, a lot of knowledge about these plants was lost, especially here in Western Pennsylvania. We don't have any reservations, we don't have any active tribes, we don't have any indigenous knowledge. And so I think part of what I need to do is, and others like me, is sort of rebuild some of that, but in ways that make sense for today. And so that's some of what I'm doing with that, is sort of saying, okay, what might these sacred trees actually do for us? What do they do herbally? What human uses do they have? Do they have bushcraft uses? Do they have edible uses? And then sort of what is their spiritual energy, that maybe divination? And eventually that's going to become probably another oracle project of some kind, but it's not quite there yet. But I think that's important. And the other reason I'm doing that is that there's this huge, really interesting sacred tree tradition that's in the UK that's tied to the Druid path. But a lot of those trees don't actually grow here. So like I've never met a blackthorn tree or a spindle tree. So I can't really like use the Ogham traditionally. But
Right.
man, devil's walking stick, that makes that would make a nice blackthorn equivalent. So it's sort of thinking about how we can use some of the spiritual tools of the Druid tradition, but in this context and in a way that's respectful and reverent of the ancestors of the land, I guess.
Yeah, for real. Yeah, for real. I just I'm really excited because I just got some seeds from Oikos tree crops of blackthorn. So I'll get to meet it. I've met the seeds now, but I'll get to grow it and get some kind of relationship with it. But it's not native here. It's not naturalized either. But so on your blog, you have this section about the Allegheny Ogham, and I think that's a really interesting project. And like regional, you're bringing it into the eco region that you live in.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, could you tell us about that, about what the Allegheny Ogham is and what the process of creating it was for you?
Yeah. So the Druid tradition has this idea of Ogham. They're really old. It's a really old tree alphabet. More contemporarily, it was also tied to divination. People aren't sure if that was actually the case because we really have like ancient inscriptions. This is the part of the problem with the Druid tradition. I don't think it's a problem. Some people do. The Druid tradition doesn't have much history because the Druids never wrote their teachings down, and so we really have a lot of fragments. So a lot of the modern Druid tradition is sort of inspired by the ancients, but there's a lot of pieces missing. But one of the pieces we have is this idea of the Ogham and sacred tree mutts and all of this thing. But again, if you're practicing a tradition from the British Isles and you don't know blackthorn or spindle, and maybe you've been lucky and met a yew tree, it's really hard to connect with that. It's hard to connect with the trees you've never met. And so the whole idea of a lot of people now are creating like regional Oghams, which is just a form of tree divination where you take the existing system of Ogham, and you try to figure out what trees might be appropriate in your ecosystem. That takes a long time. It took me several years to come up with that. Mm-hmm. And I'm still not completely happy with it, but I'm mostly happy with it. I was just debating a friend the other day about the placement of maple and hazel, but like, are you sure you want to put maple there, or beech there, or whatever? But I think it's a really useful exercise for people because you really have to learn. Like for me, when I'm doing this really ties to the sacred trees too, which is kind of a larger thing, but the Ogham is part of it. Is like looking at these trees from all of these different aspects. So where do they function in the ecosystem? You can apply the doctrine of signatures, right? Which I really like doing. What have humans traditionally done with them? Is it growing on a floodplain or not? Is it an understory tree or not? Does it produce edible fruit or is it poison? What are the traditional herbal uses? What are the traditional native uses of it? And colonial uses of it, and sort of like all of these different pieces, and you kind of synthesize them all and say, okay, I think this might fit. And that's a fun process. There's a couple other OMs in North America, like John Michael Greer. He did one for the Northwest. I think there's a Florida OM. So there, there's people are starting to create them, and I think that's a really nice expression of sort of nature spirituality for here, for where we actually live, as opposed to the British Isles, which some of us may never have set foot on.
Right, right. I think it's definitely, as you said, it's like a exercise. Whether or not like you make a OM that fits perfectly, you're getting to know the trees better that actually grow around you.
Yeah.
But that's another interesting thing about that I really like about your blog is how in your practices of how you're trying to connect to the land that you actually live in.
Yeah.
And some of the ways that you do that.
Yeah, like the you did a post in January of doing a wassail and tree blessing and pouring libations on the roots of trees, like that kind of a thing. So is there anything that you're looking forward to coming up for the next month or in February, or like coming up next? Like, what are you looking forward to?
Yeah. So yeah, we just actually wassailed this. It's just me and my partner because pandemic. But we just wassailed actually on Sunday, which is January 17th. And yeah, like this, I think that like in terms of looking forward, I think that continuing to really explore like what does our own unique ecosystems offer, and how can we deepen our practices right in those ecosystems. So I've got a couple more of those sacred tree posts coming up, which I'm excited about. But I'm also really like deeply meditating on the winter landscape right now,
Mm-hmm.
and like on this idea of the understory. And so I'm currently like working my way through like what does the understory offer us? Because we usually pay attention to the overstory trees, we pay attention to the oaks and the maples and cherries and hickories and all of that. But there's this sort of really rich, vibrant understory that happens in winter. The moss lights up, and the mountain laurels are really they're happy, and the rhododendrons are happy, and the witch hazel's blooming in the fall, late fall, and then in the early spring the serviceberry and the spice bush in particular, that's the first one to bloom.
The spice bush is great.
Yeah, and so
like viburnum up here, nannyberry. Do you have that?
Yeah, we've got nannyberry here too.
It's a great treat in the middle of winter.
Yeah, and so there's like this really interesting like winter landscape that's all tied to these understory trees that are typically pretty quiet during the light half of the year.
Yeah.
So I've been really thinking and meditating on sort of what does that mean for spiritual practice? What lessons does that offer? And I'll be writing about that probably in February. And I think the other thing that I'm just really looking forward to like this year is just I think that this is just a good time to deepen our practices, generally speaking. It looks like we probably have at least 6 or 8 more months realistically, of the pandemic. And so it's like, how can I use this as an opportunity to learn more, take some more classes, even if they have to be online, read some more books, and just really expand my own knowledge so that I can help others and help myself, So those are the kinds of things I'm sort of thinking about.
Yeah.
And, it's actually, I don't know, I feel like, there's this saying in one of the principles in permaculture is the problem is the solution.
Yeah.
And we can always find, if we look carefully enough, we can always look to find interesting solutions or opportunities within problems, or maybe more like making lemonade out of lemons. And I really am trying to embrace that during this time and really think about that. And that's actually tied to this idea of the understory, right? It's like, all the leaves drop, it's winter, but suddenly you have an opportunity, like all the moss is like, oh, finally I get some sun, and it's just this really interesting time. And so I'm really thinking about those kinds of things right now.
Yeah, cool. And then we'll have the spring ephemerals in a couple months.
Yeah.
So we don't have that much more time, Dan. It's been a wonderful conversation. I don't know if this is too big of a topic, but do you think you could touch on what sacred gardening is and
absolutely.
How that works?
Yeah. Well, okay. So this gets into permaculture, right? So, and permaculture is rooted in 3 or 4 ethics, depending on who you're asking. But it's rooted ultimately in care. So it's earth care, fair share, people care. And then I would also argue it's self-care. So those are sort of the 4.
Yeah. That's
and so this idea of, so when I think about sacred gardening, what that means, and that's actually, there's a chapter in my new book on sacred gardening too, which kind of outlines principles of it that I think are really valued. But so a traditional gardener does what? They maybe they prepare the soil, they plant seeds, and they tend the plants and they look forward to the harvest, right? And you see that a lot. You see that a lot in suburban America. To me, sacred gardening puts both sort of this ethic of care back into what we do, an ethic of reciprocation, that I am going to work to regenerate and heal and create a space for life that's not just me, but also this idea of sacredness, the idea that the garden has spirit, that you're engaging not only with a physical plant, but a metaphysical spirit. And so that really changes suddenly what you do. It's not just about putting seeds in the ground and reaping a harvest. It's about creating a relationship. It's about honoring and gratitude. And it's about engaging in this ethic of care such that, yes, I'm going to do the people care thing, right? I'm going to take care of myself as a person, and I'm going to eat vegetables. But most importantly, I'm also going to engage in fair share, where I'm not going to take all of it. Maybe I leave some for wildlife. And I'm going to engage in earth care, where I not only create a space for me, but maybe I create a pollinator hedge, or, you know, I'm thinking about how I can work with the existing landscape and bring new things in. And so like those are, and briefly, some of the things and ways in which I think about sacred gardening. But it's really ultimately about care and building relationships and building reciprocation. It's not just about what we take from nature, but what we can offer. And hopefully that relationship is so rich that, you know, there's always this sort of two-way stream where I'm always giving and I'm always receiving, and I'm always thinking about how can I do more that, you know, supports nature. That's how I it's how you take the you know, the typical American lawn. You know, the last time I looked at the statistics, we have about 40 million acres of it, and it produces it produces a ton of carbon emissions. We have oil spills all over the place, small oil spills like from gasoline, right? Gasoline spills filling up your, you know, your gas guzzling lawnmower. And like, that's not a sacred relationship with the land, right? That's a relationship where I'm simply cutting down this grass. I'm using fossil fuels to do it. So how do I remove fossil fuels? How do I start practicing these various permaculture ethics? How do I bring in this idea of reciprocation and care? How do I do good, right? So those are some of the ways I think about it. I mean, I could go on and on about that forever, but you get the idea.
Yeah, totally.
Well, this has been a great conversation, Dana. Thank you so much for being on the podcast.
Yeah, thank you for your wonderful questions, and thank you so much for inviting me.
Of course.
Yeah, so everyone can find you at adruidsgarden.wordpress.com. They can buy your Terror of Trees deck or your Plant Spirit deck, and we're going to be looking forward to your new book. What is it called again?
Sacred Actions.
Sacred Actions. Okay,
we'll
awesome.
put all that information in the show description too.
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah, I'll definitely send you links to everything too.
Okay.
Yeah,
well, thank you so much again, Dana. It was a pleasure speaking with you and getting to hear about all of the great things that you're doing for the world. So we really appreciate you taking the time.
Goodbye.
Bye.